So, what I'm going to discuss now is what people frequently ask, this question about placing on a hot plate food on Shabbat. So really, I'm skipping all the discussion about how someone must leave food before Shabbat on a hot plate or on a cooker or on this, but let's go to the example which we get asked frequently, which is, can I take food from the fridge? Can I take food and put it directly on the hot plate on Shabbat? So let me understand. There's a slight misconception that people seem to relate this to some Ashkenazi Sephardi argument. And it's not that. It's nothing to do with that. In fact, in both sides of the pitch, let's call it, there are halachic authorities stringent on both sides and halachic authorities lenient on both sides. So therefore, I will explain what the issues may be and I'll conclude about the appropriate way of, according to my understanding, the appropriate way a person should handle these instances. So, the first condition you have to realize a hot plate is a cooking element. It's got a lot of heat. It will heat up anything from cold to what we call in the halachic terms, yad soledet bo. So the first thing we have to make sure is that the foods are dry. And I'm fully aware that there are opinions which hold that if it's majority dry, it's sufficient, even though you have liquids there. But as it is a biblical machloket here, there's an argument in a deoraita, and there's great proof to say that the Shulchan Aruch holds like that, as he says, something which has rotiv, doesn't say majority. So therefore, one should refrain from reheating any liquids on Shabbat. So if you've got a food with liquid, so obviously you should abstain from reheating that to yad soledet bo. You have an option of taking the dry food and heating it separately to the liquid. So let's take the, as we mentioned, you can't reheat liquids on Shabbat. So now you've got a dry food, let's call it. It has to be dry significantly, meaning you want to warm schnitzels, you want to warm rice, you want to warm cooked vegetables, kugel, whatever you want to cook, reheat on Shabbat. So you're taking out the fridge and putting it on the hot plate. Now let's try and understand a rabbinical restriction. Even though the foods are fully cooked, so there's no more cooking to it, all I'm doing on Shabbat is reheating it, yet the rabbis further restricted people to place the food initially on Shabbat in a place where you normally cook. Why? There's a concept called mechzekem vashel. Mechzekem vashel means it appears as if you're doing an action to you, to others. It appears, so it's not marit ayin, it's mechzekem vashel. It appears the action you're doing, putting it in the source of heat, where you cook, it appears as if you're doing an action of cooking. That's called mechzekem vashel. There's a further concern of shema yachateh. That means you're putting something on a source of heat. There's a worry you might turn the fire higher because you're doing the action of placing on Shabbat. So therefore, a hot plate hasn't got that issue because it's got no knobs. You can't switch any thermometer or any knobs higher. It's on its maximum heat the whole time. So that problem of yechateh, which means to increase heat, we don't have that problem. But the first problem we mentioned of mechzekem vashel, let's call it mechze, that we still have, and this is where the argument begins. Some want to treat a hot plate, and let's start with the stringent opinions. Some hold that since you're able to cook on a hot plate, and there are some people who cook in elements like a hot plate, there may not be the shape of the hot plates which we have, but I'll tell you that I know people who do cook with the Israeli hot plate, especially, which is very hot. Today, all hot plates are the same. They've got a lot of heat, and you could cook. Furthermore, you could turn soups and liquids from cold to yad soledet bo. So it is a cooking element. So therefore, some opinions hold that the issue of mehzek and vashel that appears as if you're cooking applies to a hot plate too. So that's why they don't allow to put directly onto the hot plate something to warm on Shabbat, even if it's fully dry, because the action I'm doing appears like cooking. So the solution to them would be, if you will put a significant gap, let's take the trays of the oven, the rails of the oven. You can put it upside down, you can put it that it significantly makes a separation between the hot plate and the pot or the foil which you're heating your food up, then it already doesn't appear like cooking, because people wouldn't normally, even if they would want to cook with a hot plate, they wouldn't normally place it in such a way on the hot plate. So that will be a solution according to those opinions. So you put something which makes a significant height. The second opinion is the ones who argue and say, since normally during the week, or normally this is not an element which people would normally use to cook, so therefore the issue of mehzek and vashel drops, falls away, and therefore they're allowed to put directly onto the hot plate to heat, provided there's no liquids, to heat up the food. So it's an argument amongst the Sephardi poskim. I can even mention you a whole list of them. For instance, Chacham Ovadia Yosef, Menochat Ahava or lenient, Rav Mazuz, Chacham Mordechai, Eliyahu are stringent. So therefore we've got opinions in either side in the Sephardi world whether you should do. So to avoid all problems, how hard is to take the tray of the oven and to place it on the hot plate and then put the food on top of it. Amongst the Ashkenazi opinions as well, there's between Rabbi Auerbach, Rabbi Feinstein, Rabbi Wozner, there's different opinion whether there's the concept of mehzek and vashel on a hot plate. I do have a leniency that things which are not cooked, i.e. things which are baked, since you never bake on a hot plate. So yes, the Bet Yosef said on top of a kira, you don't put even something which is baked, but on top of the hot plate, since it's subject to an argument whether there is the concept of mechzer or not, then I have a leniency that baked food, like a cake, like a challah, you'd be able to put on the hot plate, preferably to put a little sheet of foil. That's also, you have to be careful, it shouldn't be meaty, milky, and therefore you should always put something in between, and you can heat your challah. But that's providing your intention is not to make the challah toast. Because if you do want to turn bread into toast, then we're getting into a total different discussion, and some even say that it may be considered cooking on Shabbat. So therefore, if you just want to heat your challah, you're allowed to place it directly there. Or you've got a cake which you want to heat there, so you have to place it there. Now, the concept of a dry food is if it's in room temperature, it congeals and it becomes a hard solid, solidifies, that's already considered dry. That you have to remember. So let's conclude with Halacha L'Maaseh, how people should. So when it comes to a cooked food, which is fully dry, it's got no liquids, so there's no problem of bishul achar bishul, then one may place it on the hot plate, but should take a tray to create a little gap between the hot plate and the food which you're placing onto there. That's what you do with cooked food. When it comes to baked stuff, things which are not cooked, things which are baked, since the mechzeh is subject to an argument, we will allow it to put it directly onto the hot plate on Shabbat.